And so, for those of you who don't know, my name is Jason. I'll be your host today. Kevin, who is our manager of IT, will be the one actually going into all of the information, into these training, demo, and real use cases. And we have with us as well Shubham and Eugenio. They are some of our technical staff. So if you have any questions, you have any comments, you need anything answered, throw it into the chat or into the FAQ. We'll be answering things behind the scenes as we go along. If we are seeing something that is worth bringing up in live, we'll also delay it till the end. We've got an FAQ at the end there and a Q&A. So let's contextually frame flow in its place in a business before we start talking about what flow does. Otherwise, we won't really have any good ideas of how to make it apply to your business. We have to deal with a lot of apps in the modern world. A lot might be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, too many perhaps, especially if you're operating with industry-specific, regulatory, or otherwise mandatory third-party apps. And while using an all-in-one platform like Zoho One cuts down on this substantially, saves a lot of headache, total consolidation is sometimes not possible or practical, whether it is cross third-party or even within the Zoho universe itself. The most common problem with having so many apps is the siloing or the undesired compartmentalization of information or of processes or of functionality. For example, nice and easy one, updated customer data that lives in one app like the CRM is suddenly stuck or inaccessible to your on-the-road maintenance team's third-party field app, since there's no native connection. And that mandates, all of a sudden, someone to go in and do manual data entry. We don't like the manual around here. We automate everything. Or an urgent task that came to your customer service rep doesn't automatically update all of the stakeholders, and it relies on her to manually push updates and information in a timely manner. We're now relying on people instead of processes and automations, and those can break down. The brilliancy of Flow is that even for all of the native integrations within the Zoho apps and the great number of third-party integrations, there are always use cases that couldn't possibly be covered. Flow, then, exists to be the all-purpose, build-your-own cross-app flow and integration, so that no matter how niche your need is, you can make it happen. You can make the apps speak. For today's purposes, we're going to be focusing on some of the Zoho to Zoho apps, wherein we can use Flow to build custom functions, workflows, data syncs, and other use cases. As a sneak preview, here are some of the things you should keep your eye out for as takeaways. An overview of Flow in a more technical sense, the real business use cases that we've got lined up, there's 3 of those, testing and error handling tips. Flow is a phenomenal tool. Troubleshooting it, therefore, is a phenomenal tool to have in your tool belt, and some limitations to bear in mind. Don't forget to stick around till the end for our Q&A. Of course, if you have any questions along the way, throw them in the chat and we'll answer them as we can. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our manager of IT, Kevin.
The way I think of Zoho Flow, and there's no perfect analogy for it, but the sort of the analogy that I like for it is duct tape, which is it connects things that maybe weren't connected before or don't naturally go together. Zoho has a lot of integrations between its apps, which are native and pre-built, which are really good. And but there's always going to be ways that you want data to move around that's not conventional or nobody thought of it before. And that's where Zoho Flow comes in. So the way that Zoho Flow works is that it's usually the second or the third app, or maybe the 10th app that you adopt, because what it's doing is it's sort of it's an accessory for other apps. It doesn't really do anything by itself. You wouldn't have a business or any kind of workflow that is just we're in Zoho Flow. Zoho Flow is a tool for making other tools better and more powerful and work with each other better. So usually the most common use case you're going to see with Zoho Flow is you have something happening in one of your apps, be that a Zoho app or a non-Zoho app, and you want that to result in something happening in another app. Again, probably Zoho, maybe a different app. So we'll get into some examples, but so you have some, you receive a lead from Zoho Forms, and you want that data to trigger an email, or you want that data to create an event in another system. Now, that's an interesting example because Zoho Forms does have its own integration with CRM, so you might use that, or you might use Flow if the integration doesn't fit just right. So that's sort of the standard case. Now, because with Flow, you have the option of being zero code, and you can do a lot of great flows with zero code, and it's definitely doesn't require that. But if you understand code, if you like it, then there's other things you can also do with it that you can actually have very customized events. So if you want zero code, you can do a ton of things, but you're kind of limited to the triggers and actions that are provided for within Flow, which is an enormous library. And then if you also want to do some coding, you can expand that to do pretty much anything and anywhere, depending on your level of skill. So the power of the tool is kind of only limited by your willingness to sort of try different things, but also because it's a technical tool, there are errors. So you do need to be very careful with Flow. I mean, I always say you need to test it. I mean, anytime I build a flow, and I've built many now, I still test it repeatedly after I deploy it, and then I have the users go and test it, and in case they have they're doing something unexpected from my perspective. So you really do need to do a lot of testing or have a testing built into your development cycle, because there's always things like, formatting. I got tripped up by formatting a lot in the early days with dates, because even between different Zoho apps, they format dates differently. So you try to plug in a date from app 1 into app 2. It doesn't like that because it says you're putting in 30 for the month value, and we don't like that or something. So testing it's not a sort of a nice to have, it's a must have with Zoho Flow. The other, yeah, and then also you want to do some documentation. It's always good to add notes or put in the description of what the flow is doing, so that you or a different user coming later can see what it's doing. And maybe somebody changed something in one of your apps and the flow is broken, and somebody needs to troubleshoot it who isn't you, or it's you 2 years later and you don't remember what you did. So you always want to document what your flow is doing. Basic structure of a flow. I mean, there's basically two types of things in the flow. There's going to be the trigger, which is the first thing that happens. The trigger can be, and classically the trigger is a event in one of your connected apps. So again, I add a lead in my CRM. I receive a record in my form. I receive an email. Any kind of event that occurs within one of your tools can be considered a trigger, and that can be, it's not completely unlimited, but there are a lot of different triggers that are pre-built that you can just deploy, again, no code, using Flow. Now, the other way you can trigger flows, there's a few different ways. I think there's 6 in total, but I'm only going to talk about 3 of them. Another one you can do is schedules. So you can have a flow that just automatically runs every day, every week, every month, once a year. Pretty much any schedule you can think of, you can have a flow running regularly on that schedule. I don't think there's the option to do multiple times in a day, but there are ways to get around that. But so you can have flows triggering, by schedule. And then the third way that you can have a flow trigger that's it's a little bit more arcane is with webhooks, and that means that any app that has API capability, that can push APIs, that can create webhooks, and there are a lot out there, can potentially be an origin point for a flow. And I have used webhooks with third-party apps. I've also used them on events within Zoho that weren't pre-built triggers. So when you're building a flow, you go into the library and there's a whole list of potential triggers for your flows. You might not see the exact event that you want to trigger your flow. That doesn't mean you can't necessarily trigger your flow on that event. You can also build a webhook and have it, based on a function or something. But so those are the main types of triggers. And then the other part of the flow is the actions. So often the actions will be the bulk of what you're doing with flow. You'll have one trigger and then a whole series of actions. And so you can basically, again, there's a whole library of actions within flow that you can call upon. And you have your event in the CRM, you want something to happen in Click, you want something to happen in your projects, you want something to happen in Desk, you want something to happen in email, or any of the many non-Zoho apps. Then you can have those events, and you can have multiple events, and then you can have tiered events. So you can have you take your data from the CRM, it looks into analytics, it looks into Desk, and it pushes some data into yet another app. So it can do more than one thing. It can be logical. It doesn't need to be a straight up and down line. So now I'm just going to get into a few examples. So the first one, this is the most basic kind of flow, and this is one thing happens and triggers another event. So this is a flow that we use, and if you're a customer, you might have inadvertently been using this flow a couple of times. Basically, what happens on this flow is in Zoho Desk, which is our customer service tool. If we receive a ticket, which is usually receiving an email from a customer to our customer service email account, if we receive a ticket that has the word urgent in it, that triggers an action which it creates a click. So if you're not familiar with Click, it's Zoho's messaging tool. So basically, for having conversations with your team, but also for announcements, it's a great tool for sort of just keeping in touch with people. So, and it can also be attached to Flow. So what this flow does is it takes that urgent desk ticket and it creates a click, and it sends that click to a channel of several of our senior staff who are sort of on part of the customer service team, and so they can see, okay, we received this ticket. Someone is saying they have an urgent request. I might have just let the cat out of the bag. Anybody there who's a customer of ours now knows how to get our attention on stuff. Sorry, but yeah, that's basically the flow. Is it takes those tickets and it sends them out to a group of people so that we can quickly respond to those tickets. And it's a simple two-part flow. I don't know if we have the slide with the image of this. It's not that yeah, there it is. So this is, flow itself is not super photogenic. It's basically lots of boxes connected by lines. But this is the ultimate sort of standard example of a flow. One thing happens in one app, you have an event that occurs in another app. So in this case, from desk to click. But I mean, even with that example, you can see that there are a lot of different things that you might be able to do with that. So, I mean, you can think of, well, all of the different things that might happen in desk. Maybe I receive a ticket from a specific customer or a specific group of customers, or there's a keyword, or there's a ticket assigned to a specific person, and you can have, you know, a flow trigger off of any of those things. And then, I mean, the click endpoint is incredibly powerful, but also you have to use that kind of thing sparingly. Obviously, you don't want to be spamming your whole team with, you know, dozens or hundreds of click messages, because there's an automation somewhere that is triggering on an event that occurs often. So that's the kind of thing you have to be aware of, especially with flows that have an endpoint of people, of you know, someone you're expecting to do something. You don't want to create the circumstances where you're you know, flooding people with requests, because of course, if the urgent ticket click channel was getting 5 or 10 messages every hour, the people's responsiveness to that would go down. It would lose its, I mean, you'd have to have a whole team just paying attention to that. And maybe, you know, if that's your business, that's what you want, but you need to be very careful with all kinds of automations. If there's a human element, the automation can kind of grind down the human, because you have the automation that can run 50 or 1,000 times a second, and you have the human who cannot respond in that time frame. So if you have an endpoint that's a person, you need to be really careful about how you're initiating those events, and you know, you want to control what's possible to trigger them. Okay, so that's a basic flow. Let's go on to the next one. So the next one is again kind of boring to look at. It's just a kind of a straight up and down with a couple error handling events near the end. I don't know how clear it's coming on through on your screen, but if you can look, if you see down at the bottom, there's a couple of events with arrows coming out of the side of the boxes. Those are on error events. So that's one of within the tools that you have. Yeah, thank you. That you have with Zoho Flow is that if you just build your flow like my disk flow or the click flow that we were looking at earlier, if the flow runs into an error, if it's coming down and then it tries to do something and it fails, that ends the flow. It errors out. It doesn't do anything else, which is good, because you don't want it, you know, going and doing other things based on bad data. But also, if you have events that you want to happen regardless of an error, or if you want events that happen because of an error, as you can see, the second on error there, it goes to send email. So what it's doing there is, if we have an error in this case, when it's sort of doing the final data entry into Recruit, it'll send an email to someone saying, I got to this stage and I tried to put the data in here and I couldn't find the record to put it against. And in this case, well, I'll just back up a little bit and describe what this flow is doing. So this is a flow, part of our HR suite. So this is part of our recruitment pre-screening. I know that if you've been looking for a job in the last 10 years, you've probably gone through a system where you have to do some pre-screening automations, where you have to fill in a survey or fill out a questionnaire. This is that. So this is when the potential new employee fills in or applies for the job. They will receive an invitation to complete this survey, and the survey is a series of questions. And after they fill out that survey, what it does is it takes that. In this case, it's a personality test, and basically we found that if it's really good to match people personality-wise to jobs. So if you want someone to do a job like mine, you need someone with a lot of attention to detail and that kind of thing. But you don't necessarily need someone who is a high in interpersonal stuff. So I'm a lot better working with a computer than I am with people, and so that's my personality, and I'm great in some roles, but you also wouldn't want to hire me as in a sales role. I would crash and burn in that role. So and that's not, that's just a fact about me, and it's not good or bad. It's just real, and that's what these personality tests can help tell you is who's suitable for what kind of role. And so what this does is it takes that information from that completed survey, which is a series of questions, and they answer, would you do this or that kind of thing, or would you say this is more true about you or that true about you? And then it runs it through a series of calculations. That's what all those sort of further up events are, and that's where we get into custom coding. So this actually takes that data, it creates a worksheet, and then it plugs that data into the worksheet. The worksheet transforms that data, and then it collects the data again and sends it into Recruit, saying, okay, this person has this type of personality and might be suitable for this kind of role. So that's where you start to get into some of the sort of the more codey events. You couldn't, a lot of these steps in this flow are not out of the box events. These are events, you have to sort of create your own. And one of the limitations that you need to be aware of with Flow is it doesn't store data. So during the carrying out of a flow, it can take data from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. But after the flow is completed, Flow is not storing that data. It's either plugged that data into another app, or it's used it and it's done. Now you can go into the flow and see the history and see what happened, but it's not actionable data. You couldn't run another event that says, okay, look at the data in this previous flow and do something else with it. The access to that data it's either been taken out of flow and put into something else by an action step within the flow, or it's sort of just stored as in sort of a log that you can look at, so you can see how the flow worked, and in case it broke, you can see what happened before it broke, but you can't action against that data. So Zoho Flow is not a storage place for data. It's sort of a pipe that the data flows through, and then it's somewhere else. So that's part of what I was saying at the beginning about it not being an app in and of itself. It doesn't store data. It doesn't have modules. It's just a tool for moving data between different stops. Yeah, and then what else to say about this flow? This flow, there's, I think, 3 different apps that it's applying to. It takes the data from that survey. It uses those custom functions and Zoho Sheet. So it's storing data in Zoho Sheet, so that way we have a permanent record of that data. And then it eventually takes that data and sends it back out to Recruit, where it plugs into that applicant information, and you can decide what you're going to do with that applicant after that. And then if it fails, the reason this flow most commonly fails is because at the beginning, when the applicant puts in their data, they have to put in their email address, and if that email address doesn't match the email of an applicant in our system, it doesn't have anywhere to put that data. So if they typo their email, or if they use an email address that's different than the one that they applied under, that's why this the ultimate, you can polish these automations all you want, but if you're relying on data from a human being entering data, you're still going to have the occasional failure, because people make typos, people make mistakes. which is another advantage of having flows, is that once it's working, once you've got it up and running, it will continue to do exactly what it did the first time, every single time, without deviation. So it can be, once it's working, it can be very error-free. Okay, I think that's all I have to say about this one. Let's go to our third one. So the other two flows that we just discussed were actually internal to BMI, but this one is actually a customer flow that I built, and it's sort of, this one serves as an example of sort of close to the upper limits of what's possible with flow. Because another limitation that you need to think about with flow is that it doesn't have, that when it branches, it can't come back together. And the main reason for that is every step within the flow needs to have specific, where do I get this data from? And so if you have a branch and you try to bring it back together, it doesn't know which branch to look at for that data. There is some ways to get around it, but really, if you have a lot of decision trees in your process, I'd say more than 3 or 4 decisions that need to occur, flow quickly becomes unwieldy. And we'll see that when, why don't we pull up the image of this? It's kind of a snake's nest. So yeah, and this isn't even everything. There's a few more steps below. So what this flow is when so for this customer, they have appointments, and when a customer wants to cancel an appointment, a form gets filled out. I actually believe the forms are getting filled out by an internal staff member, but it might now be customers also filling out these forms. But basically, the customer fills out the form. They say, I need to cancel my appointment, and they put in their email address. And what this flow is attempting to do is get that information about that cancellation to the correct person. So what it's doing is it's doing a lot of lookups into Zoho Analytics and Zoho Desk. And what it's looking for is information that it can tie that email address to. So it takes that email address that the person submits as part of their cancellation request, and it goes and it first looks at the list of all customers in one database. And if it doesn't find that, it looks in another place. And then if it does find that, it takes the information about that customer record and it looks for the associated location and the associated agent that's related to that customer. So it's doing another lookup based on the first lookup. And then if it does find that information, it does one thing. If it doesn't find that information, it looks for it somewhere else. So there's a series of lookups where it's trying to establish who this customer is, who they belong to, which agent should be dealing with this customer. And then if it finds all that information, eventually it creates a desk ticket. So this is a example of the first flow we did was coming out of desk. This one actually ends up in desk. So this is creating tickets for the customer support staff to respond. And the intention of this is to try and give those tickets about the cancellations to the correct agent. So it's doing all these lookups, and it's sort of baked into this system is the assumption and the knowledge that sometimes our databases are incomplete, sometimes people misenter data, or there's not a complete sort of picture of a customer in the system. That first flow sort of series of events right down the left side of the flow is if it finds everything. If it looks for the customer, okay, found the customer. Looks for the location, okay, found the location. Looks for the agent, found the agent. Okay, perfect. We have all the information we need. We create the desk ticket with all that information, and that's 90% of the events on the flow. But then, of course, sometimes you don't find a customer. And sometimes you do find a customer, but the location data for that customer is not entered. So you sort of, to get to 90%, you just have one column, and then 99% you have one error, and 99.9% you have another error, and you want to get to a fairly high standard of fidelity with this thing, because this particular customer has, there's hundreds of these events occurring every month, and you don't want to be having more than a couple errors every month. So you want to get to that 99.99%, because ultimately, if everything fails out, if it can't figure out where to send this, it's sending the ticket to the sort of the one of the managers who, and they don't want to get a whole ton of tickets. They want as much as possible those tickets going to, one of the staff who can handle them and is has a direct relationship with that customer. So that's why you have sort of this snake's nest kind of situation, is in these situations where you have multiple possible failure modes for the flow, but you want every single flow has to end with the creation of a ticket. You can't have any flows just going off into nowhere, because nothing worse than customer tries to cancel their appointment and it goes into your system and just disappears. You need to have that cancellation land on someone's desk. And so that's why you have all these different call outs and what do we do if it fails here? What if we do if it fails here? What if we do if it fails here? But also you want to minimize the amount of traffic you're sending to your manager, who sort of doesn't want to get all that traffic. Again, like I was talking about with the first one, you don't want to get a ton of automations funneling to one person, because unless that's their whole job, it'll become their whole job, or they'll start to ignore it, and those are both bad things. So the idea here is to try and spread the load as much as possible to the correct people. Yeah, so that's sort of the most complicated flow. Again, if you have an event that has more different modes than, like I said, 3 or 4 different kind of branches, you really want to have that handled within one of your other systems. So your CRM or a creator app, or another custom system that can handle all those different events. And then if flow is needed to get that data from the CRM or whatever app it's in to the other one, rather than creating one monster flow that handles all those cases, you would create a whole series of sort of very specific flows that handle specific cases, so that you're not running into this. You don't want to be building flows like this, because they are a lot of pain to troubleshoot, because there's a lot of similarly named blocks. So if it errors out, it's really hard to know which block errored, and you really want to that flow there. I would not do it again. I did it once, and I'm proud of it, and it's a functional thing that does a lot of heavy lifting for our customer. But I'd probably try a different path if I was asked to create a system that complicated again. Yeah. So so best practices. Again, like I said, testing. You want to test, and you want to try and test every scenario that your system might come across. Missing data is a huge one, because a lot of systems won't accept data without certain things. So, for example, one thing that's happened to me more than once is that Zoho CRM has what's called required fields. Some of them are required by default and you can't change it. Some of them you can make required if you're an administrator. more than once I've had a flow that was working just fine, and then someone went into the CRM and they said, well, my salespeople aren't putting in this information. I'm going to make it a required field now so that they have to. And unfortunately, it's not just the salespeople who are required to do that. The flow is also required to do that. So the flow suddenly, it's expected to be provisioning some information that's not there yet. So that's an area where, you know, something that changes outside of flow can result in it failing if you have those additional required fields. But another thing that, you know, sort of keeping in mind with required fields is you want to make sure your endpoints have all the required fields and will always have the required fields. Often you'll be doing a test and you'll say, okay, I've got this data coming in from this form. It's going to fill in these fields in the CRM. Everything's great. But then the first customer comes along and they don't put in their last name on the form because it's not a required field in the form and they don't want to give their last name. And now it's erroring out when it hits the CRM because the CRM won't accept data without that field. So that's the kind of thing where we're testing and you know, you have to get past the developer myopia where you think the thing people are going to behave in one way and you're wrong. They behave in another way and they put data in that you weren't expecting. So testing on your own is essential, but also testing with as close to the real world data as you can get. And then if you know, and then once you get to your MVP and you launch it with the customer and it's getting data from real events, then you want to keep an eye on it too, because you know, there's the people out there will do things that you don't expect. That is something you can't expect. And yeah, the error handling, that error carve out is a great tool. I'm not sure if anybody clocked it, but back in that second flow, one of the error things was just a loop back to the same box again. Sometimes things just, you know, it doesn't quite hit right and it errors out, but if it tries again, it works. So sometimes I just have an error loop back to the same event or an error out to a nearly identical attempt. Maybe I change one field or something that's particularly troublesome, but often just trying again will fix an error. Yeah, and then naming, it's really important. First of all, within Flow itself, you want to name your events as good as possible so that you know what they're doing. When you create those events out of the library, it comes with its own generic name, but you know, create module entry is not a strong name for a flow block that's creating a lead in your CRM. If you name it, then you'll know what it is. And then also, before you start building flows, if you're building the architecture that goes into the flow, having good names for the fields that you're going to be grabbing and moving through the system is really helpful. If you have a bunch of fields named X, Y, and Z, and you have to remember that, you know, one's email, one's name, and one's address, it's a lot harder than if those fields are named email, name, and address. So having good names is save yourself a lot of trouble. And then of course the logs. Even when a flow doesn't fail, you can always go back and look at the log and see what it did. 90% of my post development flow work is I'm going into histories and looking at those logs. They're really good for seeing what happened, though if you have a poor naming convention for your flow blocks, you might not know which event failed. So and then let's see, a couple other things to remember. Zoho Flow has a really great tool for versioning. So every time you make a change to the flow and save it, it creates a new version. You can always revert to an earlier version. So For example, if you go in and you do something and you think you're fixing something, but you actually break a whole bunch of stuff, instead of trying to rebuild it, you can just revert to that earlier version that was working and work from there and try to fix it from there. So that's a really powerful tool. And then another really powerful tool that I mean, probably about a year ago now, but they came out with the ability to copy blocks. So especially with that flow, that third flow, where there's a lot of repetition, recreating your blocks. I had to do that the first time I built that because it didn't have the option to copy, but now it does have the option to copy, and that's incredibly powerful with those sort of bigger, more complicated flows. I think that's everything I have to say.
Perfect. Well, that was extremely informative. We've had a few questions that have shown up in the chat, but we've managed to flag them all so far. Maybe you can speak, though, to one of them, Zapier versus Flow. They sound similar. They sound like they do the same thing. Eugenio pointed out that Flow, of course, being a Zoho tool, works great with Zoho, but are they a replacement for one another? Can we get rid of Zap and instead use Flow?
Yeah, I mean, I love Zapier. It's a great tool. Flow, they're definitely occupying the same space. So I would say if you are in the Zoho ecosystem, Flow is definitely a better choice just because it's got a lot more native integration. I think pricing wise, if you're using Zapier a lot, you're paying a lot. Flow is definitely, especially if you already have Zoho 1, because it's included in the bundle, you're not paying anything extra. But even if it's straight, you know, paying for Flow versus paying for Zapier, I think you're going to get a much better deal on Flow. But yeah, I mean, I'm not here to trash talk Zapier. It's a great tool, but Flow is also can do pretty much everything the same. Zapier's interface is a little prettier, but they're extremely comparable.
Excellent. Well, what we will do, we will leave the chat open for another few minutes, just in case any other questions crop up. Usually after sitting and digesting for a second, it gets the mind churning of all the possibilities. So by all means, if there's any questions that you have, throw them in chat. We'll be hanging out for the next few minutes. But otherwise, thank you very much for attending our webinar on Flow, and have a great rest of your day.